Are you a wedding filmmaker that is either looking at picking up a Sony a7 IV as a B or C camera, or perhaps is even thinking about an a7 IV to use as your main A camera? If so, then this video is for you, because what I'm going to do is talk about my experience using my Sony a7 IV over the past 7 months or so, not just as another camera in my kit to film weddings, but also as my main camera. And yes, from here on out in this video, all of the footage you're going to see was shot on my a7 IV for weddings. So to start, let's just talk about this camera's image quality. What you're getting here is a 33 megapixel sensor that gives you a 7K image that is downsampled to 4K when you're shooting in 24 frames per second or 30 frames per second. Now, most of the weddings I film at this point are done in 4K 24 frames per second. I found that over time, I really do like the downsampled higher megapixel sensor. Again, this is very similar to the a7 III's 6K or 24 megapixel downsample to 4K, and so I really do think this actually provides a nice added amount of detail, and is also going to give you a good amount of latitude to be able to crop into your image if and when you need to in post. Now, of course, the a7 IV also does shoot 4K 60 frames per second, and while I don't film the entire day in 4K 60p, oftentimes a lot of B-roll that I'm getting, whether that's for different establishing shots or different shots during getting ready, the ceremony, other type of reception details, these are often in 60 frames per second. Now, with the 4K 60 frames per second only being in APS-C crop mode, you might wonder if and how this actually impacts my ability to shoot this, and if I found this to be an inconvenience compared to, say, the a7S III. And I would say it really hasn't been. Now, I should note that I started with a Sony a6500, which is, of course, an APS-C camera, and so I've been accustomed to shooting in APS-C crop mode even beyond this. But as long as you have a somewhat versatile selection of lenses to work with, you should not find this to be too much of a problem. For instance, if your 24-70 becomes a 36-105, it does not take too much room to move back a bit to get your subject in frame. And furthermore, if you have, say, a 16-35 and that becomes a 24-52.5, again, you still should be able to get the shots you need without too much adjusting. There are other cameras out there with more extreme crop differences and crop factors to consider, so to me, the APS-C crop mode in 4K 60 is certainly workable in terms of just needing to get B-roll out of 4K 60 frames per second. And I have to say, I don't find myself severely missing the full frame 4K 60p that I would typically get with a camera like, say, the a7S III. In fact, if there is one thing that I do find that is a nice asset of the a7 IV, it is sort of what I just mentioned, which is the fact that maybe not just in 4K 60 frames per second, but particularly in 4K 24p and 4K 30p, you can use APS-C crop mode to get an additional punch into your image and get a bit of extra focal length out of whatever you're trying to shoot. Being able to take a lens like a 24-70 and get 1.5 times extra reach out of it without any compromises in autofocus capability or anything like that is a really nice feature to have, and I will often find myself running and gunning in certain situations with crop mode on. So having crop mode back, though it's not something I miss in cameras like the a7S III when I don't have it, is definitely something that I make use of when I do have it. So much so that I program it as my C3 custom button so I can quickly toggle it on and off. And in fact, if you want to know a bit more about how I customize my a7 IV for video, I have a separate video covering all of my different settings on the a7 IV that I will link to right above here that you could check out. Now, in particular, when you're shooting in APS-C crop mode or with a higher megapixel sensor, one of those things that some people might be concerned about is the type of low light capability you would get with a camera like this. So in terms of the a7 IV's low light capabilities, I have to say this has been one of the things that has really thoroughly impressed me. Yes, both in regular full frame downsampled from 7K modes, say in 24p, but also even in APS-C crop mode when I'm shooting in 60 frames per second. So you're going to now see, of course, a ton of low light footage, a lot of this, say, being shot during reception coverage when you just don't have as much light going on, even if you have the ability to get a light or two up of your own to light the dance floor. And I found myself easily, frankly, at around 2500, 3200, 4000 ISO, still getting really clean, crisp images that look great. And again, a lot of this comes into play where even if you're not getting quite the same low light performance out of a camera like this, having the higher megapixel sensor and a bit more fine-grained of an image to where even if and when you do introduce a bit of noise, it tends to look more filmic and film grain-like versus sort of larger, more obvious pixels that you would see, say, in the a7S III. This actually lends itself to this camera being a lot better in low light than a lot of people would often think or give it credit for. But yes, even in some uncommon scenarios you typically wouldn't expect this camera to perform well in, it has done really well regarding low light. So what you're seeing on screen right now is what looks like a typical typical daylit ceremony. But what you might not realize is that this particular ceremony was done in an extremely dark, dimly lit room that really had not much ambient light going on whatsoever. It was actually incredibly dark and cloudy, rainy out, which is why this was done sort of as a last-minute decision here. And yes, we did not actually even have an opportunity to light this explicitly, nor did the couple want it lit. And so in this case, this is where Sony cameras really do shine. Getting in those situations where you need good low light performance and you don't have the ability to add a lot of ambient or natural or unnatural light, and you have to really compensate for that using ISO. A camera like the A7 IV performs really well in this case, and it actually really impressed me in this particular scenario. Now, of course, I've also tested this a bit further beyond this, and so if you're someone that wants to use, say, S-Log3 with this, or know sort of the top end of the ISO performance, I have both a couple of videos testing this out explicitly and to note the actual dual ISO values that this camera has, which we should talk about as well. Yes, much like other Sony cameras, including the A7S III, this camera has a dual ISO system. Now, it's not quite the 4 1/3 stops that you get with the A7S III, but you do have a 2-stop light difference, which allow you to get some better noise performance out of the camera. So again, if you're shooting in something like S-Log3, being able to use both 800 as a native ISO and also 3200 as a second ISO to get clean images is going to be a major help in getting clean images out of this. And if you're someone that shoots in sort of the more in-body camera color profiles like S-Cinetone, even just having native ISOs of 125 and 500, frankly, you can go much, much higher than 500 here and still get very clean and crisp images. And yes, we should probably talk about S-Cinetone and the color of this camera. So a lot of the wedding work I do now for the main company I work with on weddings, big shout out to Terry Myers and TME, we often do use S-Cinetone for weddings. And this is because it's a great starting point to be able to grade and have ready to go images in terms of turning around weddings and other event footage. And also because for an in-body camera picture profile, even though you're getting a bit less dynamic range than S-Log3, you're still getting a great quality image that protects the highlights well, unlike say the movie gamma or standard color, which is something I've talked about before in terms of using that particular gamma curve. Having S-Cinetone as part of the A7 IV and being able to match this with other Sony cameras that also include it really make this a compelling option for wedding shooters and getting footage straight off of camera that is nearly ready to go. And of course, even beyond S-Cinetone, you're getting a lot of other great color options. As I mentioned before, S-Log3, all of the different HLG options that exist, and you're getting some of Sony's latest color science, which, yes, Sony has definitely improved their color science a fair amount over the years. If you haven't shot with a Sony camera in a while, any of the issues I would say folks used to have regarding color or sort of green or yellowed skewed images, it's just simply not really a thing anymore at this point. You may have some slight touches and tweaks that you might want to do to the image, and yes, I do mention a couple of things I even do to S-Cinetone, which again you can check out in my A7 IV settings video, but I will say that I've been really pleased with the color out of this camera, and so just getting a good image with solid color in general and being able to match this across other Sony cameras should not be an issue. Now, part of this is also because, yes, like a lot of Sony's newer bodies, the A7 IV can now shoot in 10-bit color and 422 chroma subsampling. Now again, I do think for a lot of wedding shooters, unless you're doing something like S-Log3 and really regularly pushing and pulling color there, you might not notice a huge difference in terms of having 10-bit, but frankly, if and when you need it, say if you end up overexposing a shot and you need to recover that, and or you underexpose something and want to really bring back the image to normal exposure, you're going to appreciate having 10-bit color here, and being able to shoot that not just in the classic XAVC-S codec, but also some of Sony's new H.265 options, and the all-intra XAVC-SI codec means you just have options. Now, something we do also have to talk about with the A7 IV is stabilization. Sony's standard stabilization in their cameras over the years has never been particularly excellent, but what I will say is that Sony's active SteadyShot stabilization, which they introduced back with the A7S III, was honestly a game changer, not to use a cliche, in terms of me being able to shoot handheld footage with these cameras. And needless to say, in the A7 IV, that is still the case. In fact, I frankly never bothered even doing this with my A6500 or A7 III. They just weren't really conducive to that unless I wanted to really kit the cameras out with a very heavy rig. But now I can easily go handheld with these cameras and shoot video without too much issue and still get really stable shots. And now I haven't mentioned it up to this point, but this shouldn't really be a surprise for anyone that's familiar with Sony cameras. But yes, the autofocus in the A7 IV is second to none. You're getting all of Sony's latest and greatest autofocus algorithms, you're getting touch tracking as well as face and eye tracking, and all of the different adjustments in terms of transition speed and subject shift sensitivity, and all of these things basically lend itself to having an autofocus system that works just as you would hope and frankly expect it to. Honestly, even though for locked off shots, say for a ceremony or for a reception, speech, or toast, I will still go into manual focus to be extra safe. When I'm running and gunning and actually operating a camera like the A7 IV, I pretty much leave the thing in autofocus most of the time. And I will tell you that easily 90+% of the time, if I'm just pointing it at my given subject, it is doing what I want and expect it to. And of course, if not, I can use touch tracking, I can use spot focus, I can change the subject shift sensitivity a bit just by going into the quick menu, or even the different autofocus mode, and there's a ton of quick customizations you can do on the fly that even make autofocus better to work with and more consistent and reliable. So yes, this is a camera you should feel confident in running in autofocus most of the time, and that you can count to get the shot when you need it to. Because with weddings, that is obviously critically important. You often have one chance and one opportunity to get that shot, and if you miss it, you missed it. Needless to say, with Sony autofocus and these cameras, I don't miss the shot. And that's a big thing because you cannot say that for every other camera manufacturer out there. Now, the A7 IV has a number of new features that are also pretty interesting that can help in terms of different shooting situations, those such as focus map or the new anti-flicker setting. In fact, I actually have a number of shorts on this channel that covered all of the different new A7 IV features, so I would definitely check those out if you have the chance. Though if there's one thing that is of particular note that I think is a huge innovation for Sony, it is the breathing compensation. Being able to remove any traces of focus breathing from Sony's main G Master and G lenses is a critical feature I've been making use of with this camera, and that is a really smart innovation that I'm looking forward to seeing in all of Sony's cameras going forward. Now, truth be told, there's a lot of my Sony lenses that don't have much focus breathing, but certain lenses like my 20mm G or my 50mm G Master, while they're phenomenal lenses, if there is one knock against them, yes, it is focus breathing. So oftentimes, if I'm using one of those primes or any lens that I think exhibits a bit more focus breathing, I try to make sure now that I'm using it with the A7 IV because it includes breathing compensation. And yes, I will tell you that especially at certain focal lengths and in certain situations, that does make a critical difference. Now, since weddings are typically long days, we of course should also talk a bit about battery life. Now, I have a separate video regarding battery life in the A7 IV and comparing it to the A7S III and the A7 III on this channel that you can check out. And there you're going to get a lot more hard numbers in terms of how this actually fares. But anecdotally, I can tell you oftentimes with the A7 IV, for most weddings, I would say I've easily used just a couple of batteries, maybe going to a third battery towards the very end of the night to get a little bit of extra room there. But you're easily going to get a good solid 2 to 2.5 hours of battery life out of this camera shooting 4K 24 frames a second and or with a mix of 4K 60 frames per second. And for a small mirrorless camera and not trying to rig up any additional V-mount or more intricate battery solution to it, I think this is still really good. And yes, because we're talking about battery duration and just long recording times in general, we should also touch on another factor of long recording times, which is overheating. So I will say the A7 IV is a bit more sensitive to overheating than some of my other Sony cameras. But so long as you turn the auto power off temp to high, which is something pretty much every Sony shooter does in all of their different Sony cameras, and that I've been doing since the very start, and so long as you're someone that does not need to shoot end-to-end continuous 4K 60 frames per second footage, and I'll get back to that, I have not really experienced any issues with overheating whatsoever in this camera. I've done a bunch of different shooting scenarios and elongated recordings, whether again for these 8, 10, 12-hour wedding shoots in 4K 24 frames a second, and yes, even in testing the camera in different situations there, I have not had this camera overheat on me one single time shooting 4K 24 frames per second. So I have the utmost confidence in it being able to handle that. When it comes to 4K 60 frames per second, at somewhere around the 45-minute to an hour mark, you typically would find the camera hitting its overheating limit, and you would have to power the camera down maybe for a minute or so and power it back on. That said, with the degree that I use 4K 60 frames per second footage in shooting weddings, which is again, as I noted, a lot of different B-roll and sort of these small durations of time where I'm shooting for 5 or 10 minutes. And yes, in 4K 24 and 4K 60, I've shot with this camera in some pretty harsh conditions, including one wedding that I shot in a 95+ degree Fahrenheit day in the hot sun. And so really overheating has not been an issue I've had to deal with in this camera. So long as you keep the auto power off temperature set to high and the screen flipped out, you should be in pretty good shape. And the last thing I'll talk about here is really just the ergonomics of the camera. Sony's cameras have gotten, actually, believe it or not, a bit larger over the years, and this is a good thing. With an extended extended grip compared to some of Sony's older alpha cameras. They are actually a bit easier to hold in the hands now, and so this makes the camera a lot more comfortable in the long term for handheld work, or really just handling in general. There are going to be some attributes of the body that might not blow you away. Yes, it is incredibly helpful that it has a flip screen, though the resolution isn't particularly high, and it is not nearly as bright as the one in the A7S III, but it works, and it's fine. The viewfinder also is not particularly high resolution, but again, it has a large enough eye cup for you to be able to use it, which is something I can't really say for a lot of Sony's smaller APS-C camera bodies. And this camera is actually so similar enough body-wise to the A7S III that the small rig half cage I use, which I have a separate video on this channel you can check out, I can actually swap between my A7S III and my A7 IV. So ergonomics are definitely an improvement from previous Sony cameras as well. So all in all, what are my thoughts for wedding filmmakers on the Sony A7 IV? What I've learned over the past number of months is that this is a camera that is totally 100% capable of being my A camera for wedding work. Yes, I still own the A7S III. There might be a couple reasons I wouldn't trade it in for an A7 IV, but that does not mean I cannot use an A7 IV as my main camera for weddings, because now, in fact, I have proven that I absolutely can, and really all of the major assets and benefits I want and expect of Sony cameras in terms of video work, I am getting with the A7 IV. Now again, to touch on what I just noted, would I sell my A7S III and get a second A7 IV? The answer there is no, but I do think there are a couple of key reasons why that is no. Number one, of course, the A7 IV still shoots in 4K 60 and 4K 120 in full frame. And I do appreciate the ability to shoot high frame rate in 4K without having to worry about any crop factor or being able to get the full field of view that I expect. Though honestly, this isn't a huge deal, as I noted, in that shooting in APS-C crop mode in 4K 60 hasn't been an issue for me. Though the one thing with the A7S III is that I can shoot 4K 60 continuously without any issue if I ever needed to. And that is something in the A7 IV I cannot exactly do. And honestly, as I said, this is an extreme rarity, but I do know there are some wedding filmmakers out there that probably shoot the entire day end to end in 4K 60 frames per second. And if you are one of those folks, you would still want to lean on a camera like the A7S III, or even something like the FX3 or A1 to handle that for you. But if you use 4K 60 typically for wedding work in the way that I do, as sort of a supplement for other types of footage in B-roll and getting detail shots, then I think frankly, there's probably almost no reason you couldn't go with an A7 IV as your main camera and not be totally satisfied here. And so while I shot some weddings with the A7 IV as my A camera as a bit of an experiment to talk about here on this channel, I will say that I'm going to be probably shooting with the A7 IV a lot more as my A camera. Maybe not in 100% of cases for video work, but definitely in a number of them because simply I can. This camera performs incredibly well for video work, and yes, as a tool to be able to capture key moments and make beautiful wedding films for your couples, this camera has been actually more impressive to me than I expected, and perhaps you might be able to enjoy it just the same, if not more, in terms of achieving the wedding films you want to make. So those are my thoughts on the A7 IV for wedding filmmakers. Now hopefully this video has been of some help to you. Feel free to leave a like and subscribe if it has. I have a number of A7 IV videos on this channel already that you can check out, and yes, there will be more on the way, so definitely subscribe if you like videos on this and other Sony cameras. For now, that is all I have to say, so thanks for watching.